So Declan MacManus was born in London in 1954 and raised in the capital as well as Liverpool. Elvis Costello's origin story was that he was a pen pusher in a cosmetics factory who wrote songs in his spare time, which is true, but ignores the fact that he was born into a very musical family and indeed a very long musical tradition. Only by reading his excellent autobiography, Unfaithful Music and Disappearing Ink, did I come to appreciate just how much his trumpet-playing father, Ross MacManus, raised him in an environment steeped in music of all kinds. Like a young Bob Dylan, Elvis Costello developed an encyclopedic knowledge of 20th century music of all genres and a dedication to honing his craft. Now, Elvis Costello came out of the British pub rock scene of the 1970s, which was as adjacent to the punk movement as it was to 1950s rock and roll and country music. And it somewhat amused me that he grew up idolizing groups like CSNY while totally rejecting the bombast of heavy rock groups like Led Zeppelin. And in a sense, he was lucky in that the punk rock aesthetic left little room for things like instrumental virtuosity. A rule, of course, which doesn't apply to vocalists. Snottiness, attitude, and energy are the hardest things to inject into a vocal performance. And I would put Elvis Costello up there with Johnny Rotten as one of the best punk rock singers going. But regarding his roots, like his contemporary Joe Strummer of The Clash, he was more or less a chancer when it came to his relationship to punk rock. In fact, I'd go so far as to say his first album, My Aim Is True, is little more than a bunch of country rock songs sped up to sound more punky. And as we found out later in his career, his roots did indeed stretch back even further to big band, country, and even classical music. He even learned at around the age of 40 how to read and write music for the first time, which to my mind is an incredibly impressive and nerdy thing to do. And I mean nerdy in the sense that he was a musical obsessive, like many of us, but his public persona leaned into and perhaps even popularized the nerd aesthetic, a mantle subsequently taken up by groups like Weezer in the 1990s. So alongside changing his name from Declan MacManus to Elvis Costello, it also meant putting on a pound shop suit jacket, turning his feet inwards, and playing a Jazzmaster guitar that was just slightly too big for him. His wordy and acerbic lyrics stood out in contrast to the inarticulate and dumb working-class simplicity of his punk rock contemporaries. He further leaned into the angry young man trope, supposedly carrying around a little black book with a list of all the people who had wronged him early in his career. Recorded hastily with Clover, the band later to become The News, out of Huey Lewis and The News, 1977's My Aim Is True is a brilliant album hindered by poor production. It sounds lo-fi and not in a particularly good way. The playing of the band is also not quite there in terms of forming a sonic persona around the character of Elvis Costello. Now that your picture's in the paper being rhythmically admired. A great first line and the world's introduction to Elvis Costello. And My Aim Is True does indeed contain quite a few classics in, of course, Alison, Red Shoes, and my personal favourites in Blame It On Kane and No Dancing, a song which contains a standout example of a middle 8 key change.
He's getting down on his knees, he finds that the girl is not so easy to please. After all his nights is just a paper strip tease. She caught it like some disease, and he said...
Another signature song from this period is, of course, the immortal Watching the Detectives. It fantastically showcases Costello's ability to set a scene with his lyrics and explore the emotional, dramatic, and sexual tension between men and women so often observed in his songs.
Nice girl's not one with the defects. Cellophane shrink wrap so correct. Red dogs under illegal legs. She looks so good that he gets down and begs. She is watching the detectives.
So after he finally pulled together the attractions, including Bruce and Pete Thomas, no relation, respectively, on bass and drums, plus the incredible classically trained Steve Naive on keyboards, they finally struck upon a distinctive new wave sound, firstly being overly trebly and punchy sounding drums, the Vox Continental organ, And it's through the combination of production and singing technique that Costello was really able to hone his vocal sound with his breakthrough 1978 album, This Year's Model, with its hit singles, I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea, and of course, the subterranean homesick blues inspired Pump It Up. So as I already mentioned, I spent a significant period of my 20s trying to be Elvis Costello, namely aping his rapid-fire wordplay and just the way he pitches his voice generally. Aside from being really fun to sing, it's also really high energy. Part of that choke sound that he has is that he's constantly bracing his diaphragm and letting slightly less air escape than you might expect from singing. As a result, you're constantly in this red-faced, head full of steam mode.
She's been a bad girl, she's like a chemical. Though you try to stop it, she's like a narcotic. You wanna touch her, you wanna talk to her. On the things you buy for her, could I get a temperature? Pump it up till you can't feel it. Pump it up, don't really need it.
So while it's still a really loud way to sing, it in many ways conserves your vocal cords for when you want to hit those really high notes. It's about the muscle in your core. I read a really interesting interview with Todd Rundgren talking about how he took a long time to really learn how to sing properly, and it's mostly about strengthening that muscle by singing for hours and hours at a time. So perhaps for people on tour, you become maybe hoarse and worn out through singing all the time, but your body becomes very used to doing it nonetheless. And one of the things I love about Blood and Chocolate is just how hoarse Elvis Costello sounds on it. Yet he's clearly having no trouble hitting any of the notes. It's a mature vocal style, and in his hands at least, it has enough grit and power and energy in it for it to pass as punk rock. Now, I've stolen the title of this section from the excellent podcast Chart Music. If you haven't heard of that, check it out. But what it refers to is this particular phase of Costello's career where he was regularly accused of misogyny. Now, there is a lot of naked hatred and resentment in his songs, directed at both men and women alike. But considering the nature of his nerdy persona, it's only natural that so much of his ire is directed at women. And for one, I think he's usually targeting specific people rather than women as a whole, for the most part. I would also argue that he's very often writing in character, which leaves space for the idea that many of these songs are indeed critiques of male attitudes and things like standards of female beauty and behaviour as well. This Year's Girl is a great tune that captures some of this attitude on This Year's Model.
Do you hoping that she's well spoken, cause she's this year's girl? You want it broken with her mouth wide open, cause she's this year's girl.
And in response to specific criticisms of this song, he had this to say: everything in the song is about the way men see women and what they desire from them. If there's a lie being told, then it is the one that a girl might be prepared to live or tell in order to live up to some false idea of attraction. While I think some of the objectification of women in these songs lands uneasily on modern ears, I do think by scratching under the surface just a little bit, you can see far more nuance in these lyrics. Therefore, I think it's a bit lazy to jump to accusations of misogyny in Elvis Costello's case, although I'm happy to be convinced otherwise. After all, I'm not going to pretend to speak to the lived experience of women. So moving on, Costello widened his focus on 1979's armed forces to use interpersonal relationships as a metaphor for geopolitics, critiques of Western imperialism and fascism, and vice versa. Spawning the classic singles, Oliver's Army, and my personal favourite, Accidents Will Happen, a song unusual for Elvis Costello, at least for me, in that I find it really difficult to work out the chords and what's happening harmonically. Again, utilising Nick Lowe as producer, Armed Forces really solidified the band's sound and represents Elvis Costello's commercial peak. This Year's Model and Armed Forces are held up by many as 10 out of 10 examples of Costello's Imperial phase, and people are not wrong to argue that. So I'd like to ward off any criticism that I don't believe these are perfect albums, because they are. But I also think Blood and Chocolate is perfect. So it's a testament to this man's genius that he has so many albums that could be considered his best. At least 5 10 out of 10s, in my view. I could have easily made this video about Trust, Imperial Bedroom, or even 2002's When I Was Cruel. He really is that good. So that aside, while America fell in love with Elvis Costello in 1979, his steamroller tour of the USA in that same year came to a dramatic halt when he did a racism. Which is to say, he drunkenly employed a nasty racial slur in what could only be described as an outrage contest in a hotel bar. Now, I'm not particularly interested in talking about this incident because when you look into it, it appears to be little more than a admittedly regrettable mistake and not really evidence of any kind of deeply held racist viewpoint that Elvis Costello held or holds. Most of us, at one point in our lives, have used regrettable language in order to trigger a reaction, or in the moment it felt amusing for whatever reason. I, for one, look back on my teenage years and cringe at how frequently the homophobic F-slur was thrown around in my social circle. And like many of these things, this shame and embarrassment should be turned into an opportunity for learning and self-improvement. After all, we're all works in progress and we fail the final exam of life. However, it is interesting to think that had this incident not occurred, Costello's career may have taken a very different trajectory. Bruce Springsteen is often seen as Costello's American counterpart, as another Dylan-esque wordsmith jumping on the latest trend as a springboard to worldwide superstardom. But frankly, Bruce is too good-looking, too everyman, and in my opinion, too one-dimensional for an artist like Costello to even bother emulating. So while the incident did provide something of a circuit breaker in his career, firstly doing penance by embracing black music for 1980's excellent Get Happy, the hugely underrated Trust, and the first of his many genre experiments in the mostly unloved country covers album Almost Blue. 1982's Imperial Bedroom announced Costello as a fully grown-up artist, singing about grown-up issues with a grown-up sound and no longer attempting shiny pop music. I have at various times considered Man Out of Time as my #1 favourite Elvis Costello song.
He's got a mind like a sewer and a heart like a fridge. He stands to be insulted and he pays for the privilege. To murder my love is a crime, but will you still love a man out of time?
Almost everything he writes has a hidden depth or double meaning, so that this song, on the face of it, is about a political scandal and a murder, but it could easily be also read as a song about self-disgust and the strains of a romantic relationship. As a live entity, in 1982, I would argue that Costello and the Attractions were at an absolute peak in terms of set list and pure energy, and it's a bit sad that I can't find more recordings or bootlegs of this period. So after this followed a few albums that, to my mind, marked the end of Costello's Imperial phase, and tensions within the Attractions caused him to branch out into his very first solo albums with other bands, basically, despite him already being considered in the public consciousness a solo artist for the most part. Which leads us up to 1986 for their reunion on Blood and Chocolate. And that's it. The album cover itself features a painting by Elvis Costello under the pseudonym Napoleon Dynamite, linking, of course, to the song Poor Napoleon. He used this alter ego as the master of ceremonies for his spinning songbook tour many years later, and the name also inspired the 2004 film of the same name. So Blood and Chocolate went on to become Elvis Costello's lowest selling record in the UK and in the US, and his last record for Columbia. And to this day, he has continued to make occasionally brilliant and occasionally not so brilliant albums. I mentioned before that 2002's When I Was Cruel is a particular favourite of mine, a record that tries and for the most part succeeds to introduce Costello to the trip-hop and alternative rock generation. And 2004's The Delivery Man, which is his take on a southern rootsy Americana concept album. An honourable mention also goes to 1994's Brutal Youth, for which I also have a soft spot. He still continues to tour almost constantly despite a fairly recent health scare, although he is nowhere near as prolific recording-wise as he once was. I haven't heard all of his records of the last decade or so, but I suspect there is something of value on all of them. Moreover, Elvis Costello has definitely cemented himself as an elder statesman. At this point, there is not a single accolade or prestigious gig that he hasn't won. Going into acting, writing, TV show hosting, conducting, you name it. He married jazz singer and pianist Diana Krall in 2003 and has since mostly lived in the US of A. If you liked this video, please do me a favour and hit the like button, but if you didn't, rather than hit the dislike button, can I suggest you leave a comment and let me know why? I'm always open to feedback, advice, and opinions that challenge mine, plus it apparently helps me game YouTube's algorithm. If you subscribe and ring the bell, it will let you know whenever I put something new up. You can follow me on all the socials if you're so inclined, and if you'd like to incentivize me with a $5 a month to continue doing these videos, a link to my Patreon should be just beneath this video. Cheers.